Hello, everybody. I'm back and I'm going to read the last section of The Princess Royale from Princess Anne to Princess Mary to Princess Anne. It's written by Helen Cathcart. And this chapter is entitled Travels in Twenties. And in this book, it's actually a long chapter, so I'm going to see if I have to break it up into two, but it outlines the travels, and the work ethic that you'll see. Look how Anne was. She looks a lot like Zara, but she had such an amazing work ethic. She did so many engagements. Some of these tours were some very tough tours. You know, they would they would put to shame even the most stringent people. But what I'm going to do is read, because it's a pretty long chapter. These next two chapters are very long, on travels in 20s and then in partnership, but they are so telling. If you hang in there and read them, they're so telling when it comes to the information about Princess Anne and the type of person she is and how hard she works. And she's got a birthday coming up on the 15th of August, and I wanted to finish this for anybody that might be interested out there. Until the 1970s, young Princess Anne had followed the Queen's overseas tours by news reports, phone calls, letters, and her mother's amateur movies and everybody's conversation. In that order, with no real sense of personal involvement. Then the Queen and Prince Philip undertook to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Captain Hook's voyage by a 2-month tour of New Zealand and Australia. Following roughly in his footsteps, and Anne found herself enmeshed in a high-pressure tour that even hardened palace officials termed as one of the most difficult yet physically. In Australia itself, the royal group, which also included the Prince of Wales, was to have 235 engagements in 35 days, compared with 97 and 38 days on the visit of 7 years earlier. The route lines in the wall charts, they looked tangled and intricate, causing one of the secretaries to jest. If you lose the book, which is the itinerary, you'll be on a desert island for life. And Anne once again flung into the deep end, into a plan that, as she said at the time, it made me lose sleep over excitement. To a friend, she also expressed the lesser cheerful prospect. I hope we won't be stuck in a lot of stuffy town halls. And the family no doubt discussed the deterrent at the breakfast table. The Queen was troubled by ancient and perennial complaints that she met too many officials and did not meet the people. Although officials are obviously always the people's representatives, as if by Bush telegraph, the New Zealand High Commissioner's staff in London knew months beforehand that an indignant young voice at the palace had asked, "Why not go out and meet the crowds? Why not get engulfed?" And when the royals arrived in Wellington and promptly went on a walkabout, the effect of the Queen's orange coat and of Anne's lemon outfit was a deliberate RAF or an NZAF, markers flung into the stormy sea. Anne impetuously headed into the crowds, determined that nothing should mar a technique she had evidently suggested and polished with unstinted confidence. Talk about diving right in. Wow. Summing up the end of the tour 2 months later, not to add her subsequent Canadian travels to the Northwest Territories and her visit to Washington that summer, One remembers that no teenage princess had ever been before had traveled so far and so variously or faced such sustained exposure to the public eye. The princess shrugged and said, "Well, I just simply tagged along." Yet it was already experiencing tagging, requiring constant adaptability and watchfulness in support of her parents. Royal tours, they can be too readily taken for granted. The Australians, they complained that she did not smile enough, and Anne tried to put it simply, "It's difficult to keep a smile always bright." Having expected the tour the pretty demanding, she approached each task with a willingness of doublet facing a 5-barred gate. Doublet, I believe, is her horse, so. An ever resulting pleasure. The pleasures were innumerable, and that seemed a bonus. A weekend away from wintry London, and with the day lost into the international dateline, there was the air traveled, conjuring trick of being in the South Seas, downing her first bowls of traditional kava, first on Fiji, then on Tonga, awaking to a serenade of nose flutes, and trying not to tread on the children's fingers when they unexpectedly wanted to stroke her wet look shoes. There was the yuck yuck Tongan feast of sucking pigs that she had seen time and time again on the Windsor movies. But the films, they lacked the mingled scene of hibiscus and basted crackling that confirmed the reality. The autocratic king, Tofahu, had ordered a special issue of postage stamps which included the glamorous Snowdon photographed on Princess Anne. And then in Wellington, apart from the welcoming carnival of small boats, crowds were smaller and quieter than she had expected. The hurrahs of popular description were in fact oohs and ahs and scattered cries of "Hi, Annabelle." But there were just less comfortable manifestations. The pressing groups of 100 or more filled with an urgent wish to shake hands. The sudden outbreaks of touching fever. Flying to South Island to spend the first weekend on a sheep station with Eklund family. Charles and Anne described to their hosts the entirely new physical sensations of the walkabout. "It's like being at some enormous party," and they argued the good sense of safety precautions that would still have give enhanced pleasure to the crowds. Riding in the rain, they only later heard that their parents sailing aboard the Britannia to South Island had unexpectedly encountered fantastic gales, causing the royal yacht to practically stand on the end in the walkabout of its own. So the tour went on, undampened by the persistent wet weather. Anne reckoned one evening that she had established a record mileage, splashing around the agriculture showgrounds near Christchurch. While the Queen and Prince Philip often followed their separate schedules, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, they pursued their own programs of junior events, such as the lunch with all the prefects of local schools, or a reception of youth organizations, all with walkabout trimmings. There had surely never been a royal tour so diverse in the events it offered the local people. The sparse earlier crowds of the tour were replaced by multitudes, lured from their television sets by the chance of talking to the Queen, or persuading Anne to admire one's string of kids. As one correspondent said, the effect was electric. People strained to have a natter. and the effect on the royals were scarcely less stimulating. At dinner, everyone had a different crowd story to tell. In Auckland, Princess Anne happened to tell one woman, "I'm used to the rain," and heard the phrase repeated and repeated to the back of the crowd like an echo. "Used to the rain, used to the rain," surprisingly culminating in a terrific cheer. One of the equerries asked afterwards, "What on earth did you say to them?" Meanwhile, Australia loomed to Anne as something tougher and more intimidating. Despite Charles's reassurance that one played it along, the chief difference was that the walks around the town hall were stepped up to a far more vocal audience. The wind blew, and the wolfish whistles shrilled. In Sydney, on the second day, the press decided that Anne, wrestling with the streamers of her turban, had asserted, "I can't see a thing in this bloody wind." Or was the expletive something firmer and even worse? Cooked up as it was, the absurd controversy seasoned the tour with Australian relish. Reactions could be foretold. If Anne looked bored during a tour of a power station, succumbing at last to turret explanations, one could put that down to inexperience. When a Canberra student in outlandish drag thrust a bouquet of weeds into her hand, Anne played it along to resulting cheers. If a crowd looked baffled at being hemmed behind a hefty barricade, the princess copied her mother in going as close as possible to the rails, often worrying the police by her apparent disregard of crowd pressures and the hazards. There were dangerous spots, such as Collins Street, Melbourne, where two people in fact died in the crush. Unknown to walking royals, and dozens arrived in a hospital after one wild jostle to get within talking distance. Anne dropped and showed any show of enjoying herself when she noticed a small boy, lost and wailing, and at risk of being trodden in underfoot, and rather commandingly she stopped the fiesta until a policeman made sure he was safe. Trivial in itself, this incident in turn made news all around the world. Behind the public scene, there remained a congenial string of happy private social events, partly fixed up by Prince Philip through the Michael Parkers and the other friends, partly through the solid acquaintance established by Prince Charles during his 2 terms at Timbertop, the outback colony of Geelong Grammar School. To see Timbertop before Charles flew home to resume his studies at Cambridge was an unquestioned must, and they went up from Melbourne to a weekend of riding and exploration in the gum forest in the company with Charles's old school friend, Stuart McGregor. Nevertheless, the new generation of Timbertop boys seemed rather vague about the visitors. "You're welcome, Margaret," said one, until Princess Anne explained her identity. After Charles had returned to England and the princess was on her own, she quietly spent a weekend with a Queensland farming family, helping in a sheep roundup before returning in time to join her parents aboard Britannia for a cruise along the Great Barrier Reef. It would be diverting at some time to record the ever-varying scenes in which the Queen had celebrated her birthday. Her 44th anniversary was spent in a light-hearted picnic on an uninhabited island with her daughter and husband, and they helped to find, during which the princess explored the coral reef so energetically that she returned to Canberra with her legs scratched and they were bruised. And Bill Hesselstein felt called on to deny that she had been badly bitten by mosquitoes. But this was merely to put the rebuttal before the bites. In Canadian Northwestern Territory, 2 months later, the swarms of skiddas and black fly, they were ravenous. And the queen and her daughter, they wore trousers in self-defense. Okay, just a moment. I think this is one of the times where Queen Elizabeth, in her whole life, had worn trousers to ward off the the bugs. So I'm just going to show you that picture. Do you see? Here's the queen. She's wearing trousers. She never wears trousers, but when you're fighting mosquito bites, you definitely want to wear something to protect you. Part 2. In a jovial aside to Commander Fulford, the naval doctor on the tour of the Northwest Territory and Manitoba in 1970, Prince Philip asserted that all his family at least made excellent guinea pigs in the physiological effects of climate. Through 2 months of midsummer, Princess Anne undertook engagements that included trips to Germany and Glasgow, Dusseldorf and Durham, and then, from London in July, they all dropped suddenly in the ice-fringed airport of Frobisher Bay. Amid the welcoming band of airmen, Eskimos, and government folks, Anne discovered herself instantly cast in an unofficial role as a visiting commandant of the Eskimo Girl Guides, and it was noted that she was, in fact, carefully chosen. She had, in fact, carefully chosen a stable hat to help dress the part. Her father had been enthusing on the lonely attractions of the Canadian Arctic for years. To sleep the first night in a newly built hotel, its modern elegance still smelling of cement, so breakfast on the fish that Prince Charles had literally caught through a hole in the ice, to try an impromptu walkabout in the Canadian Legion Club as the high spot social center in town, to fly onto the Resolute Bay, and to lodge the following night in a schoolhouse, can all be inferred as lively reportage for Princess Anne's personal journal. Joining the tour from Ottawa, Charles had brought along a girl of Anne's own age, Premier Trudeau's niece, Jocelyn Rollet, so that the 3 young people formed their own lively trio when off duty. In Yellowknife, they touched down suddenly into a temperature in the 70s, out of parkas and into lightweights, as Charles recommended when the plane radio gave the ground temperature figures, and a light-hearted barbecue occupied the long evening of the 24-hour Arctic day. Loud cheers for PA, particularly where we go, we wrote one member of the royal retinue, the royal visitors. They stayed up into the small hours to see the midnight sun, only to sight but a dismal gleam behind the rain clouds. Flying south again into the scorching heat of the Manitoba centennial celebrations, Mary Donney, the lady in waiting, had cause to smile wryly when she opened some mail and had to pass the princess a query on the forthcoming 1971 Save the Children visit to Kenya, then in the planning stage. For me, it's a super pleasure trip, Anne had told a group of hip youngsters. When asked about her Canadian impressions, while the Queen and Prince Philip bore the brunt of the Manitoba official ceremonies, inspections, and luncheons, Anne and her brother snatched carefree leisure from the side excursions, a canoe jaunt along the Red River, a horse show at the Swan River, a helicopter swirl along the shores of Duck Bay. But in Brandon, the heat was still more intense, and some of the all-seeing news scouts considered the princess somber, a criticism that was to seem like the first cloud in a summer storm. At its climax, the intense program promised Anne the silver lining of her first experience in the United States, in the shape of a very private visit to Washington at the behest of President Nixon's two daughters, Tricia and Julie. But the privacy is relative and unguaranteed, especially for a royal princess's first visit to a feminist republic. Okay. Prince Philip had cautiously hinted at the possibility of not getting very far, not seeing very much. Through the predictable cordons of police and the ferocious wolf packs of reporters, like any father, he may have wondered whether Anne had paid any attention. Her first stings of disillusion may have come in the adulatory atmosphere aboard the presidential plane which flew the royal visitors from Winnipeg. Then the strains of Rule Britannia and the fanfares of the herald trumpeters greeted them on the lawns of the White House, casting a trained eye over the phalanx of press, TV crews, and other onlookers. Charles' equerry, David Checkers, estimated their number of several hundred. Then there was President Nixon himself, with microphones ready, waiting in the stifling heat to recite a speech of welcome stiff with State Department compliments. The perceptive journalist who said that the Princess Anne could not conceal a mood of incredulity and vague discomfort had misinterpreted her wry sense of humor. Anne's happier anticipations of the American scene were promptly realized, however, when she and Charles zoomed over Washington in a helicopter an hour or two later for a barbecue at Camp David. The presidential retreat in Maryland with Tricia and Julie Nixon, Julie's husband, David Eisenhower, his sister, Susan, and others in a pleasantly youthful and friendly group. While most of the youngsters went swimming, the princess was content nonetheless to sit in the shade of the patio. With motherly intuition, Mrs. Nixon saw that she was exhausted and marveled at her resilience. Later in the evening, they took in the Lincoln Memorial and the moonlit view from the top of the Washington Monument. Among other sights, not omitting some walkabout questions to people in the eternal crowds, a reporter seized his opportunity to ask questions of his own, and had said with a smile, "I don't give interviews," a remark that sounded off and was sour when reported in print, torn from its context. That night, she slept at the White House in the four-poster bed in the Rose Room, where her mother and grandmother had slept before, as Mrs. Nixon mentioned the next morning. "But not Queen Victoria," Anne teased. "No, but she gave us a desk made from the wreck of the British ship, the Resolute." "There's a coincidence," said the princess. We were in Resolution, scene of the shipwreck, only last week, and was on her marks for the rest of the day. They made the obligatory tour of the Capitol and the Smithsonian Institute, where they found the moon astronauts. Neil Armstrong and Frank Borman were waiting to show them around and answer questions. "But I could ask you questions all day," the princess told Borman. Lunching on the presidential yacht Sequoia, they sailed down the Potomac to Mount Vernon. But Princess Anne first took time to transfer to one of the Coast Guard speedboats with Mary Donney and streak up and down the broad waters. The breeze was wonderful and refreshing. On the visit to Mount Vernon itself, the princess faced one of those ordeals that she dreaded. George Washington's homestead is elegant and charming in its exterior, but it would take the brush of Hogarth to delineate the terrible scrimmage of cameraman and commentators in its small domestic rooms, a jostle so unseemly that even the calm squadron leader, Checkett, felt called on to cry, "Let's have some dignity yet." There were mere incidents, after all, probably less jading than the handshaking of the long reception lines at the British Embassy tea party. That evening, the princess and her brother slipped away from the White House to pay an impromptu visit to an open-air concert in Lafayette Park. The orchestra rose to the occasion by playing Pomp and Circumstance March, and the audience rose similarly in a storm of welcoming applause. At the ball at the White House later that evening, Princess Anne danced into the small hours, and yet was up at 9 a.m. for a day of high speed, but mercifully less official sightseeing with Tricia and Julie. It's just that I can't get used to the 20 million reporters at my heels, she said ruefully and apologized. And they successfully took in the boutiques of Georgetown, an art gallery, and a baseball game before rejoining Charles to catch the BOAC night plane home. Part 3. If the milestone of a 20th birthday should seem bright with auguries, Princess Anne's anniversary, it was indeed fittingly ornamented. The royal yacht Britannia was once again cruising off the west coast of Scotland, and the princess's birthday cards were appropriately delivered by helicopter. The guest list included Princess Alexandra with her husband Angus and her younger brother, Anne's favorite, Michael. That's right, Anne did like she really liked Prince Michael. But Anne sometimes withdrew from the family group to do her little jobs. She enjoyed working for an hour or two in the calm of her stateroom, with the radio jingling and the gentle tremor of the ship in smooth passage. Books of Kenya were piled with her writing magazines, and writing event entries shared her cramped desk with the itinerary proposals for her first solo tour. One of the most minor events of the year was a return to Benenden to open a new wing, blended with the serious business of having a score of years to her birthday, and gave pause for thought. She could consider herself somewhere midway between leaving school and getting married, and having accepted the presidency of the Save the Children Fund, she still wondered if she were doing enough. The Prince of Wales was planning to spend a few days on an African safari early in 1971. Why not come along, he offered. Prince Philip suggested that the best way to publicize an organization was to make a film about it, and the two ideas coalesced. When the BBC agreed to make a television safari film for the popular Blue Peter children's program, Anne remarked that all the television cameras in North America had at least got her used to being followed around with one, if it would do any good. The New Zealand Save the Children organization just then reported an immediate increase of membership for the fund. It's a result of Princess Anne's interest. And so a dual project was agreed, not for one film, but ultimately two, both to further the SC work and the funds. Charles and Anne Charles and Anne flew out to Nairobi together in an RAF plane on 6 February 1971. The date itself is not insignificant, for it was 19 years to the day since their mother had been staying up country in Kenya at the Treetops Lodge on the morning of destiny when she became the queen. At Nairobi, brother and sister then parted company, the princess wasting no time in beginning location work with Valerie Singleton and the film unit. We hadn't been filming a couple of minutes before we knew that if the film was a flop, it wouldn't be Princess Anne's fault. And so the producer, Ed Barnes, one of the essential sequences of the film was set in the Stairboy Center where the waifs are given practical help when they wander in from the bush. No longer overconscious of the cameras, Anne found it was like being a house mother again. On seeing her in a cotton frock, the boys of the school could scarcely believe she was Princess Anne. Children usually disbelieved her on that score. Though the boys knew, they knew her at once when they wore a gold and white gown at the school entertainment. Trailed by the film unit, she made a sentimental journey to treetops. As her mother had done, she sat on the balcony, her Pentex poised for the animals who might visit the waterhole and the forest clearing below. Another evening, the dialogue of a writing sequence was being planned when the princess surprised Val Singleton by talking about her ambitions as a 3-day event writer. There was no limit to what one might do. One might be chosen for the team to represent Britain in the Olympics. Anne was thinking ahead to the Crookham and the Rushall trials as the highway to badminton and to her own confident prospect for April and when the film would be shown. When April came, she was already concerned with the production of her second film. In scenes ranging from her palace apartment to a play center in Islington, a picture which in the event was screened at a 650 Save the Children Fund Club branches throughout the Commonwealth. Meanwhile, the world had already noticed how a certain Lieutenant Mark Phillips of the 1st Queen's Dragoon Guards increasingly preoccupied her in a friendly rivalry, and at the Rushall horse trials he came superbly first on the Great Ovation. An 8-year-old he had been thinking of selling the previous year. Princess Anne was 4th on doublet, the splendid jumper of South American stock which her mother had given her at Christmas. And now the challenge was definitive. "See you at badminton then," she said, looking at Mark straight in the eyes. Even the supercilious, who had pretended to regard royalty as a little account, were infected with the enthusiasm of that unforgettable badminton 3-day event, shared with millions as it was throughout by television and all the public media. On the opening day, Princess Anne led among the 25 entrants who had competed their dressage. And the next day, Mark Phillips alone managed to get in front of her with a difference of only 7 penalty points. Subsequently, he maintained his lead across the 35 fences of the rigorous cross-country course. while Anne lapsed to fourth on the timing. On the third day, one show jumping error reduced the princess to fifth. Doublet's hind leg having splashed the water, and Mark Phillips was the immaculate winner. That night he partnered Princess Anne with the Queen and Prince Philip and other guests, and at the Duke and Duchess of Beaufort's victory dinner at Badminton House. Despite her measure of defeat, the princess was radiant. She had not only credibly ridden against the best event riders in the world, but was now at least in line for a team place in the European Championships, and perhaps even the Olympics beyond. And was there, too, in her heart, some inkling of a future celebration at Badminton House. The happiness of her betrothal was just 2 years ahead. So I am going to pause it right there and break this up into another chapter, and we will read in the next section how her romance and her friendship and romance and the similarities of Mark Phillips and Anne's interest in horses and horse racing began. So I'm going to end it here, and we can pick this up in the next chapter, the next section.